There are secrets that are never written in Western books and newspapers. There are decisions that shake the international order, but are only transmitted by handshakes in the dark. And in the midst of Africa, burning with the desire for freedom, there is a name that makes the great powers whisper in fear: Ibrahim Traoré. He is not just a young general who came to power after the sound of a coup. He is the one who chose the path that no one dared to take, opening the door again to North Korea. A seemingly impossible step, but it became a lightning bolt that tore through the night. Sending a message: Burkina Faso will never kneel. This is not just a diplomatic story. This is a battle between independence and dependence, between those who want to impose and the peoples who refuse to be subjugated. Backhand index pointing right if you believe that this is the moment when Africa rewrites its destiny. Please like, comment and subscribe to join this journey. In March 2023, Burkina Faso announced the restoration of diplomatic relations with North Korea after years of international pressure. It was a diplomatic coup, since Pyongyang was considered a pariah state by the West. But in Traoré's hands, the move meant something else, a blunt declaration that Burkina Faso would find allies where its rulers had never expected them. North Korea, which had survived decades of sanctions, immediately opened up opportunities for training, arms, and shared experiences of self-reliance. And Burkina Faso, caught in a storm of rebellion and Western pressure, saw in it a model of resistance, an example to learn from. But the big question began to ring: would this unlikely alliance become a springboard for freedom, or the trigger for an unprecedented confrontation? Imagine a Sahel night, the sky pitch black, the sound of rebel gunfire echoing across the border. In a small room in Ouagadougou, maps stretch out, red lines running from Burkina Faso to Pyongyang. No one believes it. One of the world's most besieged countries is joining hands with a poor African country. But it is from this suffocation that Ibrahim Traoré finds new breath. "We have nothing to lose but our chains," he says in a closed-door meeting, his eyes blazing. The words spread like wildfire, shaking the ranks of young soldiers who have seen their friends fall to the blades of rebels. Why did Traoré choose North Korea? To many in the West, it was madness, diplomatic suicide. But for a leader in the midst of war, that madness was the way out. Burkina Faso is surrounded from all sides. In the north, extremist rebels set up camps, attack villages, kidnap children, and turn fields into dead land. In the heart of the capital, pro-Western forces sow doubts, creating the specter of international isolation to shake the will. And beyond the border, the superpowers are trying to tighten sanctions, preventing Burkina Faso from buying weapons, even fuel. In that context, Traoré realized the West never wanted Burkina Faso to win. Because a victorious Africa means an independent Africa. And that is what they fear most. North Korea became a mirror. A country isolated for more than half a century but still maintained its sovereignty. Could still produce weapons, and still made even the American superpower wary. Traoré looked at it, saw the shadow of a Burkina Faso he longed for, small but indomitable, poor but never bowing. The first meeting with the Pyongyang representative took place in silence. No flashbulbs, no grand statements, just a hand extended in the darkness. Behind that handshake, there were unwritten promises, weapons, training, experts, and most importantly, a spirit of resistance that had been tested by fire. It was during those nights that Traoré learned his most important lesson: survival is not about waiting for someone to save you, but about forging yourself into steel. Small shipments began to appear. First rifles, then mobile defense systems, and finally military experts. Young Burkinabe soldiers, accustomed to old colonial guns, held new weapons for the first time, their eyes lit up. They believed that history was changing. Information leaked out. European embassies panicked. Washington called an emergency meeting. Western media unanimously called Traoré a dangerous dictator, a bridge between Africa and one of the most abandoned regimes. But that shouting only made the people of Burkina Faso more convinced of the path they had chosen. In the markets, ordinary people passed around the saying, "If North Korea can survive against the US, why can't Burkina Faso?" These seemingly simple words became a spiritual weapon sharper than any sword. Traoré understood that the West feared more than North Korean weapons: the spread of resistance. A Burkina Faso that could stand on its own could become a lightning bolt to the global system of domination. But the alliance did not only bring hope. It also ushered in long nights of tension. Strange drones appeared near the border. Western hackers began to attack military systems. Rumors of new sanctions were spread, like a knife hanging over the head of an impoverished country. Traoré was undeterred. He summoned his generals and declared bluntly, "We have chosen this path. Whatever storms arise, we will go to the end. This is not just Burkina Faso's fight. This is the voice of Africa, which has been silenced for too long." The declaration became an oath. And this is when the story ceased to be theirs. Because freedom is not a gift of a nation, but a fire that spreads. If you feel Traoré's courage, if you believe this is the sound of Africa rising, share your thoughts in the comments. Because every voice, no matter how small, can become part of the storm. Within months, Burkina Faso began to change. The army was trained in a new way. Learning to coordinate, to exploit technology instead of relying on courage alone. Villages that had been occupied by rebels were liberated. The red, blue, and yellow flag flew over churches and schools, replacing fear. People began to believe the impossible: Burkina Faso could defend itself, without foreign troops. It was a spiritual rebirth not seen since Sankara. But the stronger Burkina Faso became, the more it was watched. International organizations warned. Great powers held meetings in the dark. Some African politicians were pressured to criticize Traoré. They called him a man who plays with fire. But for the people of Burkina Faso, that fire was the warmth of survival. The world began to divide into two clear camps. On one side were those who believed Traoré was pushing Burkina Faso into the abyss. On the other side were those who saw him as a hero who opened the way for the whole continent. In the closed-door meetings, Traoré knew the danger: if the West decided to tighten sanctions, the country could fall into a crisis of food, fuel, and health. But he also knew something else: if he bowed his head, all the sacrifices would be meaningless. A battle without gunfire broke out, a battle of wills. When the secret transport planes touched down at the Ouagadougou night airport, no one knew that history had changed. 700 people, without noise, without publicity, quietly walked out. They did not come as mercenaries, they came as symbols. On their shoulders were not just guns and bullets, but the memory of a people who had been besieged, who had survived global sanctions, and still held their heads high. The people of Burkina Faso called them many things: the warriors of the night, the steel wall of the East, or simply brothers. In the eyes of the villagers, their appearance was a promise that Traoré was not alone. That the small country in the Sahel now had friends willing to live and die with them. Within weeks, the Burkina Faso army barracks had changed. The young soldiers, accustomed to lax discipline and patchwork equipment, were now facing a training method so harsh that many thought they would be unable to endure it. Night marching drills, guerrilla tactics in the desert, the ability to camouflage themselves as if they were disappearing into the sand, all were taught not from textbooks, but from the survival experience that North Korea had accumulated over decades. But the strange thing is, instead of complaining, the Burkina Faso soldiers began to smile. Because they understood that discipline was not to turn them into tools, but to turn them into masters of their own destiny. They were trained not only to hold guns, but to believe that they could protect every field, every river, every roof of their people. And from the barracks, that spirit spread to the streets. People whispered about the early morning training sessions, about the troops returning with shining eyes. Children ran after the troops, shouting, "The Sahel will not surrender." Of course, this change could not hide the Western spy ring. Within months, secret reports from Paris, Washington, and Brussels all contained the same phrase: Burkina Faso is transforming into a model of total resistance. On the desks of NATO generals, maps of the Sahel were heavily marked. They were concerned not just about the presence of 700 North Korean fighters. They were more concerned about something immeasurable: morale. Once populations began to believe they could defend themselves, that stabilization campaigns the West had built would collapse like sandcastles. We cannot allow Ouagadougou to become another Pyongyang, an unnamed EU official exclaimed. But what they don't understand is this: Burkina Faso doesn't want to be a copy of anyone. It wants to be itself, but strong, proud, and self-reliant. Here, history sets up an asymmetrical confrontation. On one side is the Western system, with its banks, aid, surveillance drones, and directional media. On the other is a poor country, with its iron-fisted warriors, and a young leader who believes in absolute freedom. But that asymmetry is what makes it strong. Like David facing Goliath, Burkina Faso has learned that it doesn't need the most sophisticated weapons. What it needs is an unbreakable will. And North Korea, with its experience of surviving sanctions, is the perfect example. Traoré understood very well, to keep the nation standing, he needed not only warriors, but also faith. In front of tens of thousands of people in Ouagadougou Square, he said firmly, Burkina Faso is not a pawn on anyone's chessboard. Our brothers from the east did not come to occupy land, but to teach us how to stand on our own 2 feet. We will not repeat the mistakes of the past, when freedom was exchanged for empty promises. The cry of Traoré, Sahel, freedom, resounded like thunder. It was not just a slogan, it was an affirmation that the nation had chosen a path of no return. The reaction was not slow. International banks began to freeze accounts, aid was cut, and the Western media simultaneously reported that North Korea is invading Africa. They created the image of cold-blooded mercenaries to spread fear. But the people of Burkina Faso no longer believe in unfamiliar voices. When they see fields protected by young soldiers from terrorists, when they see the streets calm again after years of chaos, they know what is true and what is false. An old woman in the market told a reporter, "We are not afraid of what the media says. We only know that tonight, our children will sleep peacefully." From Burkina Faso, the news spread to Mali, Niger, and beyond. Many young people in Bamako, Niamey whispered, "If they can do it, so can we." Photos of Burkina Faso soldiers and North Korean experts training side by side spread across social media, becoming symbols of a new concept, a global resistance alliance. This is no longer a matter for one country. This is a question for an entire continent. Can we learn from isolated countries and find in them the key to freedom? But the road ahead is not easy. Traoré knows that every step will provoke more enemies. The 700 fighters cannot stay forever, but they can leave a legacy, the spirit of self-reliance. And the question hangs, like the sword of Damocles, how far will the West go? Will it stop at economic warfare, or be ready to intervene militarily, as it did in Libya, Iraq, or Mali? The people of Burkina Faso sigh but do not bow their heads. Because they know, freedom always comes at a price. And this time, they vow that history will not repeat itself. The writer cannot stand aside. If you are reading this, remember, this is not just a Burkina Faso story. This is a question for all of us: can we accept a world where the freedom of a people is stifled by the strong? Spread the word, share it, let the world know that a small people are challenging the powerful. Because our silence today could be our chains tomorrow. Fire like, comment, subscribe if you believe that freedom cannot be bought. Burkina Faso is not fighting for itself, it is fighting for the promise of a world where human dignity is more important than profit, where sovereignty is more sacred than imperial power. Ouagadougou was plunged into a night of gunfire. The news that North Korea had sent 700 special forces was no longer a secret, the whole world knew, and the whole world was watching. But those who wanted to bury Traoré were no longer hiding. They launched a comprehensive counterattack, diplomatic, economic, military, media, all converging into a storm unprecedented in the history of Burkina Faso. In those days, the people of the capital lived in a state of constant alert. Loudspeakers along the old town warned, "Beware of spies. Stand by the nation." But it was not just spies, but also fake news that flooded social media. They portrayed Traoré as someone who sold his soul to a foreign power, as an adventurer who is dragging Burkina Faso into the abyss. Western media rushed to proclaim that North Korean troops have taken over Ouagadougou, imposed iron discipline, and taken control of the country. But the reality was different. People saw with their own eyes the quiet, disciplined Asian soldiers who did not loot or interfere in daily life. They only trained, only stood guard at strategic positions, only communicated with the Burkina Faso forces. For many young people, this appearance was nothing more than a spiritual medicine. They whispered to each other, "If a weakling like North Korea can stand firm against a superpower, why should we bow down?" The enemy knew that a direct attack could fail. So they chose to attack from many directions. First, the economic front, sanctions were discussed at the United Nations. International banks simultaneously blocked Burkina Faso's money flow, foreign businesses were forced to withdraw capital. Food and fuel prices skyrocketed. Long lines of people lining up to buy bread and rice became a daily sight. But contrary to the enemy's expectations, the people did not revolt against Traoré. They endure, they organize their own community kitchens, they turn hardship into pride. "We have endured terror. We have endured hunger," said a mother in Ouagadougou. "But this is different. This is a sacrifice for the future of our children." Second, the diplomatic front. Western ambassadors put pressure on neighboring countries to isolate Burkina Faso. But the unexpected happened. Niger and Mali, instead of turning their backs, publicly declared solidarity. They repeated, "A besieged person today, could be us tomorrow." That message echoed across the Sahel, collapsing the divide and rule plan that had existed for decades. Third, the military front. Terrorist groups have stepped up attacks on the northern border. New weapons, new tactics, clearly foreign hands. But this time, the defensive wall is different. The Burkinabe soldiers, trained by North Korean special forces, fought like a reborn army. The once collapsed checkpoints now stood firm. In many battles, the terrorists were repelled with heavy casualties. The news spread quickly, raising the morale of the entire population. But amid this confidence, there was darkness. One night, a fire broke out in the administrative district of the capital. Unknown gunmen broke in, destroying archives. Many high-ranking officials suspected that spies had paved the way. This was the first crack, signaling that the enemy was not only outside. Traoré understood that he was entering a life-or-death struggle. He gathered his cabinet and said frankly, "If we fail, not only will Burkina Faso collapse, but Africa will lose confidence. Everything we are doing, not for ourselves, but for the whole continent." In that moment, the 700 North Korean soldiers were no longer strangers, but became a testament to the new international spirit, not based on exploitative interests, but on the common survival of threatened peoples. Night after night, the city lived in tension. The lights often went out due to power cuts, but the fires from the communal kitchens remained on. People told each other about North Korea, a country that was once surrounded, but still built nuclear weapons, still maintained its independence. They saw in it not a danger, but an example for Burkina Faso to learn how to stand firm. Western journalists described a capital occupied by foreign armies. But the residents of Ouagadougou themselves said otherwise. "They are not occupying us. They are keeping terrorists from occupying us." Young volunteers lined up to join the militia. They chanted, "We are not afraid of hunger. We are afraid of losing our country." It was here that Burkina Faso began to turn the crisis into an unprecedented mass movement. The rest of the world looked at Burkina Faso with a mixture of fear and amazement. Fear, because of the dangerous precedent, a small country dared to defy all sanctions, all standards set by the West. Amazement, because despite everything, the people did not collapse, but held their heads high. At the United Nations, heated sessions revolved around the question, will Burkina Faso become the second North Korea of Africa? But that very question made many other nations think, if a small country like Burkina Faso can challenge the old order, why can't they? In the darkness of the crisis, a new light shone. The people of the Sahel began to see Traoré as a symbol, not just of Burkina Faso, but of a generation. And the presence of 700 North Korean soldiers was not only military, but also symbolic, that solidarity beyond Africa's borders could also be a weapon. In a speech in the square, Traoré held his head high, his voice booming through the loudspeakers. "They want us to be poor, they want us to be divided, they want us to submit. But we will not. Burkina Faso will not kneel. Africa will not kneel. If they want to turn this place into a battlefield, then we will turn it into the birthplace of a new era." Tens of thousands clapped their hands, chanting, "Fatherland or death." The storm was coming closer than ever. But it was in the midst of it that Burkina Faso found the strength to stand tall. There are moments when history is broken not by the arrows fired by an external enemy, but by the trembling hands of its comrades. In the case of the Burkina Faso-North Korea alliance, the rift came not from the bullets of an invader, but from a whisper in the corridors of power. A secret report from Ouagadougou revealed that some generals, with interests tied to Western financial funds, began to doubt the deep presence of North Korean advisors. They whispered that the training was turning the Burkina army into a copy of Pyongyang, that the country could lose its identity. The whispers turned into networks, and the networks into conspiracies. One night in July, a group of senior officers attempted to blockade the barracks where 200 North Korean advisors were stationed. Their plan, to cut off communication and pressure Traoré into reducing his dependence. But they underestimated two things: the loyalty of the young soldiers, and the watchful eyes of the Pyongyang survivors. The North Korean advisors had noticed something was wrong 24 hours in advance. The power supply was being tampered with, food supplies were showing signs of being stolen, and some military vehicles were moving without orders. They immediately alerted Traoré directly. And as night fell, the barracks, which had seemed to be under siege, suddenly lit up with flares, a signal of a counterattack. The whole city shook. Armored vehicles roared, guns rang out, but it was not an external enemy, but the shadow of an internal confrontation. Burkina Faso, a country that was writing a new epic, was suddenly dragged into a pit of suspicion. The people were shocked. Was it his own hands that had stained the path to independence with blood? That night, Traoré did not appear on television, but a brief statement was circulated: treason is the most serious crime. No one has the right to exchange the freedom of the people for fear of foreigners. The next morning, a series of high-ranking officers disappeared from the ranks. Some were arrested. Others fled towards the border. And from within public opinion, a new storm arose: is Burkina Faso tearing itself apart before the enemy can act? That was the turning point. The North Korean-Burkina alliance, once hailed as an iron shield, was now shrouded in suspicion. The West immediately took advantage of it, spreading false news that Traoré had lost control, that the army was divided, that the country was about to collapse. But in that chaotic vortex, there was one thing that the enemy did not anticipate: the fire of the young generation. Gen Z soldiers, citizens who have never lived under direct colonial rule, are not afraid. On the streets of Ouagadougou, thousands of young people carry flags, shouting, "We are not traitors. We stand with Traoré." It is this explosion that turns the twist into a jolt. Instead of collapsing, Burkina Faso has entered a period of purification, removing the shaky hands, keeping the hard hearts. But the cracks have been exposed, and the enemy outside is waiting. The big question now is no longer, how strong will the alliance be, but, can Burkina Faso survive the storm from its own darkness? That night, Ouagadougou did not sleep. Before the rumors of betrayal had subsided, the image of 700 North Korean soldiers marching down the main avenue took the breath away of the whole city. Their footsteps were heavy, their eyes were cold, their red flags fluttering in the Sahel wind. Burkina Faso, a small country that was once looked down upon, is now the center of the world. Ibrahim Traoré stood in front of the square, his arms raised high, his voice resounding: "We bow to no one. We rewrite our destiny with our own blood and will." The words immediately spread across social media, burning in the hearts of young people from Bamako to Conakry, from Accra to Nairobi. This is not just a story about Burkina Faso. This is the manifesto of a generation, the African Gen Z, who dare to look straight into the darkness. Dare to fight against oppression, dare to write a new chapter of freedom. Remember, the enemy is strong, but unity is stronger. If you believe that Africa deserves a new dawn, spread this story, let the whole world hear the footsteps of young people who are rewriting history. Backhand index pointing right, like, comment, subscribe, because this fight needs your pen, your voice, and your heart.